And welcome back to the EDCO Evolve On Conference. I'd now like to welcome our session sponsor, Trudy Parsons, Executive Vice President of MDB Insight, to give a brief welcome. Welcome, Trudy.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Kate. My name, as Kate said, is Trudy Parsons, and I'm with MDB Insight. We're so excited to be joining our friends and colleagues in economic development and workforce development from across Ontario for this morning's important conversation. MDB has been a proud sponsor of the EDCO conference for many years. Workforce development and labor market planning is complex. COVID has just added to that complexity. Its impact on people, service delivery, and our economy has been heartfelt, and it's forcing new ways of thinking and doing. As communities look to retool and refresh economic development strategies, it's imperative that we also remain focused on how we support alignment between our labor supply and demand. We must position our businesses to be competitive, and we know that in many cases that requires talent. MDB Insight are optimistic cheerleaders to Ontario's future. We recognize that there are challenges, some that were being felt before COVID. I think of the tourism sector as an example. Even with the temporary and permanent business closures that we've experienced, we're still seeing businesses struggle to find the talent that they need. Our efforts as a province and as a country will be dependent on our ability to respond in a timely fashion. MDB Insight is certainly no stranger to workforce development conversations. It's actually one of the key drivers to us being a founding partner with Workforce Central Canada, a platform that promotes space for conversations and knowledge exchange on anything and everything related to workforce and labor market planning. Our ongoing podcasts and our leadership forum held in May are just a few examples of where we bring folks together to have answer the tough questions and have the tough conversations. Just like this morning's panel, these are vital in order to share the ideas, nail down what the exact issues are, and come up with relevant and progressive solutions. We at MDB Insight are excited to play our part in helping to forge Ontario's economic competitiveness as we look to the future. I'll now hand it back to Kate Ward, Commissioner, Pay Equity Office of Ontario, and please enjoy your workshop this morning. Over to you, Kate.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Trudy, for those fantastic opening remarks. I've worked with MDB over the years. You've always been great partners. To the audience, over the past several weeks, the economic development community has been discussing the rapid economic changes that have been brought on by COVID. This is obviously the compelling theme. But I think more importantly, we've been discussing forward. We've been discussing and focusing on how to evolve on, or evolve Ontario into a prosperous, recovered future. Ontario's workforce, or said more plainly, our people, are vital in this prosperous evolution. So today we are so delighted to have the Honourable Minister McNaughton, Minister of Labour Training and Skills Development, with us today, along with Louise Taylor-Greene, President of the Human Resources Professional Association of Ontario. And Rocco Rossi was scheduled to attend, but we've had a last-minute shift in the program. Daniel Safayeni, VP Policy with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, is with us today to talk about and share insights from the province's positioning Ontario's workforce for recovery, and then broader HR and business themes following related to that. So each of our speakers are going to give opening remarks followed by Q&A. Minister McNaughton, we're so delighted to have you. You're going to lead. We know that we have you for 30 minutes, which is such a generous sharing of your time. So thank you very much. And we'll start with a discussion with the minister, followed by Louise Taylor-Greene, and then followed by Daniel Safayeni. So Minister McNaughton, again, pleased to welcome you, and the platform is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you this morning. Katie, I want to first begin by thanking you for all the work that you're doing. And I guess we can still say your new role as Pay Equity Commissioner. You're doing a great job in that office, and thanks for your service. I'm really honored to be here with Daniel and of course with Louise on this panel. I think it's going to be a great discussion and a really, really important one. I think it would be fair to say, and quite frankly, an understatement to say that it's been obviously a very, very tough 12 months for workers, for businesses, and for anyone looking for a job. Ontario has suffered tremendously during this pandemic, just like every other province, every other jurisdiction right around the world. But I think it's important to be optimistic. A recovery is on the horizon. So first, I thought we could look at where we stand right now. At the start of the year, the unemployment rate in Ontario was 10.2%. That's down from last May when it was a high of 13.5%, but it's still almost double what it was last February before the pandemic hit when it was 5.5%. Stats Canada estimates that over 400,000 workers in our province lost their jobs between February 2020 and January 2021. That's more than 400,000 hardworking people who lost not only their source of income and their sense of purpose, but more importantly, they lost a sense of pride. Jobs matter, and we all know that they change lives. So while doing everything we can to stop the spread of COVID-19, we're also preparing to leave nobody behind in our mission to spread opportunity more widely and fairly. That includes reforming our apprenticeship and skilled trade system, making it simpler to navigate. Before the pandemic, unemployment was at multi-year lows, as I mentioned, and many businesses reported recruitment challenges, especially in the skilled trades. Today, unemployment is high, but there is still demand in many sectors. As Ontario recovers, we know the number of jobs available will only grow. To fill these roles, businesses depend on people having the chance to train and learn the right skills. So we're working to simplify the skilled trade system to help workers prepare for success and lead them into rewarding lifelong careers. First of all, we're continuing to break the stigma often associated with the trades. We want young people and their parents to recognize that many of these jobs in the skilled trades are fulfilling, exciting, and well-paying options. We all know tradespeople that earn six figures, and this is even more impressive considering that these folks didn't have to take on large debts to pay for post-secondary school like many university graduates. And even a young person knows they want to become and even if a young person knows they want to become a set designer or a baker or a millwright, too often their parents, and their guidance counselors don't know the right path to achieving that goal. I've heard it time and time again. Young people know what they need to do to become a lawyer or a dentist, but not an arborist or a motorcycle technician. So to give people the chance to start on the path toward a great career in the skilled trades and to do this earlier, and to better communicate what the skilled trades are all about, we're investing $44 million in expanding our apprenticeship pathway program, like Skills Ontario, the OEAP program, and pre-apprenticeships. We want high school students, their teachers, and their parents to know about the skilled trades, what they offer, and how exactly to pursue them. Next, we're also simplifying the apprenticeship and skilled trade system. We're investing $75 million to make training for a skilled trade more accessible. We're increasing financial supports to people who aren't eligible for employment insurance while attending in-class training. We're launching a new non-repayable tools grant that provides apprentices with up to $1,000 to buy their tools of their trade. That could be professional shears for hairstylists, or voltage testers and meters for electricians. And we're investing over $5.5 million in the colleges and other organizations that offer apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship training so they can implement COVID-19 health and safety measures. This includes buying PPE or installing plexiglass dividers where needed, or setting up online training for subjects that can be tackled remotely. Finally, we're doing all we can to boost employer participation in the apprenticeship system, and this is really key. We're investing $21 million in a brand new achievement incentive grant that encourages small to medium-sized businesses to train apprentices. The grant offers financial incentives for various steps apprentices take on their path to becoming qualified journey persons. This will help apprentices stay on track and help employers retain their trainees. We're also investing $20 million in the new group sponsorship grant that helps small businesses come together to sponsor and train apprentices, rather than requiring employers to take on apprentices on their own. And we're partnering with industry on workforce planning for major infrastructure projects. So you can see we're leaving no stone unturned in our mission to help those who are interested find good jobs in the skilled trades. We're encouraging more employer participation in apprenticeship, and we're helping businesses find the talent they need while preparing people for meaningful careers in the skilled trades. These actions will help our employers, our workers, our soon-to-be workers, and our economy as a whole. We're looking forward to seeing the impact these investments and initiatives have over the coming months and years. We're looking forward to rebuilding Ontario's vital skilled trades sector, and we're looking forward to our economic recovery and a province that's stronger and more prosperous than ever. So with that, Katie, I'll turn it back over to you and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Minister. I know personally, and the audience will definitely appreciate hearing both the immediate and long-term transformative or evolutionary approach, especially in introducing trades and introducing new options for career growth that actually fill major labor market gaps. So thank you very much for sharing that. We'll go through our speakers, and then I'll come back to you with specific questions. So I would like to invite Louise Taylor Green, President of the Human Resource Professional Association, to give an overview of workforce evolution from the human resources point of view.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm really humbled to be here with your esteemed panel, and nice to see Minister McNaughton again, and Daniel, nice to meet you, and Jody, thank you as our Pay Equity Commissioner for bringing us together today. In all sincerity, I feel like I have to put my cards on the table with this audience and humbly admit that I don't know a darn thing about economic development strategy or policy. You folks are absolutely the experts in that arena, but the one thing I know for sure is that a huge part of the prosperity of any community is dependent on jobs in all sectors. And that's where some of my professional experience is relevant. In my day job, I oversee HRPA. We're the largest regulatory HR association in the country. And in fact, there are more of us HR professionals in Ontario than anywhere else in the country. In fact, there's 51,000 of us here. A lot of people think about HR as that department that does the hiring, firing, and retiring. And while that may have been true 30 years ago when we were called the personnel function, I can tell you that today, HR professionals are very business savvy and have specialized education and skills that will help business and society function optimally. And if we look back at the issues that have affected workers over the past several years, the #MeToo movement, Black Lives Matter, Time's Up, and now COVID-19, which has necessitated the most radical workforce transformation we've seen in the post-war world. And happening right now, without any question going on into the future, is the disruption of traditional work because of technological advancements like AI and RPA. Because jobs will change, workplaces, workers, and education also need to adapt at clock speeds we've never. As I mentioned, in Ontario today, there are about 51,000 people who are practicing HR, but only 43% of those are regulated HR professionals. Those HR professionals that are registered with us are held to the province's highest standards and are obliged to comply with rules of professional conduct and ethical standards that set out the duties on HR professionals around competence, legal requirements, dignity in the workplace, etc. And you might say to yourself, okay, so why does that matter? What does that have to do with economic recovery? Well, it matters because HR professionals are going to be called upon to help get workplaces back up and running. They're going to be the ones supporting business leaders in recalling laid off workers, ensuring that workplaces are safe, that legislative obligations are upheld, that human rights and access to employment are administered fairly and effectively. Workers are going to need to be reoriented, upskilled, and redeployed to meet the needs of new jobs and new organizations. So all of our efforts to restore the economy really can't be undertaken without some intentional consideration on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because if we look at the stats, women, and particularly BIPOC women, have been disproportionately affected because of the pandemic. They generally hold lower paying, more precarious roles, and they have fewer employment alternatives. And when faced with challenges around childcare, family care, or illness that could prevent employment, these individuals are forced to decide between family obligations and work. Furthermore, they're heavily concentrated in the service sector, which has seen the biggest downsizing in the labor force. So work and access to jobs are absolutely critical to a thriving society. But we've got to be hyper aware of this fear and uncertainty about returning to the workplace. Workplaces are the second leading source of COVID-19 infections in the province. So economic recovery efforts have to be built through the lens of physical and psychological safety. We're going to have to help our communities be safe, support small and medium business with the resources and clear guidance that they need to operate safely for their customers and employees. I know workers want to get back to their jobs, and although many will be permanently displaced, those that do return to work are going to expect reassurances and safeguards about coming back safely. For those that are permanently displaced, access to skills retraining in an accessible way is absolutely essential. And I applaud the province's second career grant as a great start. These new operating programs on increasing supports to access apprenticeships and skilled trades are fabulous. But we also need public and private partnerships to increase access to experiential learning. I know that shovels in the ground is often the preferred way to stimulate economic recovery. And I would encourage everyone involved in economic recovery and community-based growth to consider that there's so much more economic opportunity out there if we look at the entire value chain instead of just the supply chain, and really focus on investments that are going to close the looming skills gap. So I would say three things come to mind to me. First is dive deep into the data. Your partners in workforce development councils across the province are amazing partners, and I encourage you to work with them looking at current and projected total economic impact of anchor industries in your communities, and really look for those emerging opportunities, because that's where the growth will be. Second, I would say get to know the talent and skills profile in your community, because you're going to be left out of the game if the people in your community don't have the requisite skills needed for growth industries. And lastly, I would say, look at your policy stance on matters of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Critically evaluate your contracts, collaborations, or partnerships, and set minimum thresholds or standards that should be applied to ensure equity, diversity, and inclusion. Like the Honourable Minister, I do have an optimistic view of the future of work in Ontario, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today on behalf of all the HR professionals that are helping make business and society thrive. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you very much, Louise. Appreciate your broad strokes panorama of sort of workforce and HR and the dynamics right now of the disruption in the workforce, not just the physical space, but also the types of jobs that are going to be needed in the future, and the types of programs the province is responding with, as well as what HR and workforce development professionals can be doing to anticipate. So thank you very much. I'd like to invite Daniel, and thank you for your patience, Daniel. The floor is yours to share insights from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce perspective on labor and changing workforce as the business dynamic changes across the province.
Thanks so much, Katie, and thanks to Minister McNaughton and Louise Taylor Greene as well. Certainly echo much of the comments that have already been made. And Rocco, of course, sends his regrets, and you'll have to do with me instead, unfortunately. So I'll dumb things down accordingly. Katie, I should also say you nailed the pronunciation on my last name, which folks that I've known most of my life don't even do. So thank you for that. Look, as the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, we represent some 60,000 businesses across Ontario of all sizes and across all regions, as well as 140 local boards of trades and chambers of commerce as well. And I know we'll get into the data and the specifics a little bit more as the session evolves, but let me just maybe start with a few stage setting points. So the data leaves very little room for doubt. The COVID-19 crisis is having an uneven, an uneven impact across our population. And so that means different businesses and communities are being impacted differently. We just did our annual Ontario Economic Report, which I know we'll get into in a little bit, but this is a survey that we run of all of our members throughout the fall. And here's what we know. Yes, business confidence reached an all-time low. Businesses were extraordinarily pessimistic about the economic outlook and themselves, their own outlook as well. That can be expected. I don't think there's much of a shock there. Where the data gets more interesting is how this has impacted certain communities and certain regions disproportionately. And so we know the hardest hit sectors are by far those that require face-to-face. So accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment, recreation, retail. This has also had social implications as well. And Minister McNaughton and Louise Taylor-Greene were just talking about this as well. So we know, for instance, younger women have been disproportionately impacted. Stats Can recently confirmed that women aged 15 to 24 are the furthest from recovering from pre-pandemic levels of employment. And we also know that lower income, racialized Ontarians have also experienced disproportionate financial pressures, not to mention higher COVID-19 case counts on average than the rest of the population. The other thing the data tells us is that small businesses are experiencing more liquidity challenges, deeper HR impacts, and lower levels of confidence than larger ones. And we know a lot of the government's programming has been targeted specifically to try to alleviate this, both in terms of credit and support. And maybe the last thing that I'll just dwell on here is that regional economic performance in Ontario has long been imbalanced. Even prior to this crisis, we always saw the Greater Golden Horseshoe area outpacing population and employment growth in large swaths of Ontario, particularly Northern Ontario. The crisis has exacerbated that trend and accentuated it. However, there have been other regions which have suffered as a result of the crisis as well. And that is a slightly new dynamic because of the cross-border situation. So you look at Windsor, Sarnia, Hamilton, Niagara Peninsula, regions that rely on big cross-border trade and tourism have taken hits. And so, you know, the main point of all of this is that we need to be mindful about how we go about recovery and support planning because it should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. We can begin to draw some conclusions about what this will mean for recovery efforts, and at a very high level, providing access to infrastructure, including digital infrastructure like broadband, is going to be hugely important and was identified as a major priority by the business community. Reskilling opportunities, which I know we're going to unpack in this panel conversation, is also going to be enormously important, particularly for small businesses. And access to capital, which is something that we hear again and again, but is particularly true for small businesses. And so, look forward to unpacking some of these trends in a more detailed way as the conversation goes. And I'll also want to give a shout out to Minister McNaughton and his team, because I know a number of the measures they've introduced have been with this effort in mind, with reskilling, micro-credentialing, trying to improve the workforce development situation and make it a more resilient workforce for Ontario. There's a lot we can capture in terms of future growth and potential. I don't want it to all be a bad note here or a downer. So there's definitely a lot of assets Ontario has that they can build from as we look to recover and grow. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Safayeni, for your great remarks. I will get into the questions on the data later. Right now, we'll ask some questions to the minister as his time is tight. So just before I ask you your first question, Minister McNaughton, we do have like a note of thanks from the municipality of Northern Bruce Peninsula, just basically saying thank you for the efforts and outreach to especially educating youth and high school students on the skilled trades. It's immensely important in rural areas. So I wanted, if you haven't seen that, I wanted to just pass along thanks on behalf of the municipality of Northern Bruce Peninsula. So thank you very much again to all of you. Minister McNaughton, I think this government, and we've heard it from our panelists, has effectively acknowledged the impact of COVID, obviously, and taken action to keep employees safe and support businesses. So in addition to the great information you shared about the skills retraining and other programs, last week you talked about $150 million skills development fund for training projects to help people get back to work. Can you tell us a bit more about that fund and how economic development agencies or workforce development boards can really leverage that for their communities?
Well, thanks. I actually made a note. I wanted to mention that during the Q&A session. Look, I think Louise touched on it, and Daniel did, about the importance of retraining and also partnering with private sector providers. So I did announce a $115 million skills development fund last week that really is going to allow delivery providers, training delivery providers, to come to us with innovative solutions for training. This is going to be a really quick turnaround. Applications are open today, and we want to ensure that we have these contracts signed by the end of this fiscal year. The focus right now is to help those workers that have been impacted by COVID-19. So as Louise mentioned, we did launch a redesigned second career program, and it's about helping those workers displaced who have lost their jobs because of COVID-19 find that short duration training. So all of these programs are 12 months or less to find training close to home for good jobs close to home. And we're really staying away from a one size fits all solution. It's really based on local community needs, and we're backing everything up by data. One of the stats that I really believe holds true today, now the numbers will be a bit different, obviously, because we're in COVID, but literally the day before COVID hit Ontario, 200,000 jobs were going unfilled every single day in communities right across the province. The Conference Board of Canada pegged that cost at a loss to Ontario of about $24 billion per year. That need clearly is still there. My philosophy, my lens that I look through this and every policy that we develop is based on the fact that good, meaningful jobs change lives. They strengthen all of our families and build stronger communities. Daniel mentioned it. I mean, there's a lot of regions in this province that have been neglected and forgotten about. I think of, where I come from, and you too, Katie, in Southwestern Ontario. I mean, over the last 20 years, we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. There's a lot of people that feel forgotten about. And my belief is that we need to level up this entire province. I'm really proud of our government's focus on a historic investment in broadband, in natural gas expansion. I mean, all of these things, plus our investments in the skilled trades training and upskilling workers, are going to make a huge difference, like life-changing for so many people. So this skills development fund that we announced last week is going to be one sort of tool in that toolbox.
Thank you very much for expanding on that in case our economic development community missed that really amazing opportunity. You actually answered a question that was in the question from Tommy Gilliby Curtis, was asking about data about labor shortages in Ontario and the skills gap, but I think you've effectively communicated that the programs you are announcing are based on data and skills shortages in the workplace. So that information exists. I'm assuming it can be found on the province's website if EDOs want to find out more information. Second question, and the last one, because I think you have to go, and this I guess is more aspirational, because we know that challenge, if you're doing a SWOT analysis, challenges and opportunities are like side by side. So what would you sort of aspire or challenge the economic development members in this call and municipalities to think about? Like, what legacy do they actually have a moment right now with COVID is transforming things, but the government's responded with certain programs and opportunities. So what would you say to economic development agencies? Like, how can they leverage all this to come out of the pandemic? What vision could they be holding for their community based on what your ministry and the government and in general is providing?
You know, think outside the box. Every program that we're announcing is new for Ontario. I really believe truly that we're leading not only Canada, but North America with some of these innovative training solutions. Again, we've seen in the past under, you know, all different governments of all different stripes, a one size fits all solution for the entire province. I really believe those days are gone. I mean, I think of the Second Career Program where, you know, in the past, it was a 2 or 3 year education training program. Well, now it's 12 months or under. So I really want to emphasize thinking outside the box. We really want to partner with training providers out there. It doesn't have to be something that's been done in the past. I also believe, and maybe this is, you know, a message to leave everyone with, I think we have a huge opportunity here. I actually am very optimistic about the future. I know that there are better jobs out there for people. In fact, you know, we know, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs during this pandemic, but many of these, if not all of these jobs that are out there are actually paying better than some of the jobs that people have lost. So I think that's good news. And I want to ensure that, you know, as government, we're there to have the backs of these people to, you know, really help them, give them a hand up. I mean, I don't want to be ideological, but there are some on the left who think, you know, government should do everything for people. There are some on the right that think government should do nothing. I'm here to tell people that we're here to help them, to partner with them. Government has a role to play to give people a hand up. So think outside the box. My door is always open. We're always interested in innovative programs to just to help people on the ground.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your generous time today and for the information you've shared. I hope that the audience have a better understanding of the programs now available through the ministry and how they can leverage them for economic evolution and economic recovery in their programs. So thank you. We understand when you have to jump off. So all the best, and we will be in touch. I'm sure this community is very active, so you will hear from us.
Great, thank you. I just have to give a shout out to one person because I know he's on the call. His name is Russell Press from my hometown in Southwestern Ontario. So I have to give a shout out to him.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Excellent. Take care. Thank you very much, Louise and Daniel. I hope now we can dive in a little bit more on some specific stuff that you guys said in your opening remarks. And we have questions coming in from the audience, and there's a couple that I'm going to direct to each of you because I know your backgrounds and your organizations and you'll be able to answer them very well. So Louise, I want to hit on this sector shift that's happening because you talked about it in your opening remarks, the massive disruption. Mm-hmm. Daniel, you've seen it in the research. There's massive disruption that's hitting regions differently, and I know the EDCO members will absolutely feel that. So Louise, you have firsthand experience from an employer's perspective, which I think is very relevant, about the economic impact of anchor sectors in the community, where real workforce challenges arise when that sector has shifted, right? And I think there's a lot of communities on the call that might be mono-industry towns or were mono-industry towns. They had one major employer and it shifted. Or they may have a diverse economy, but they still have one or two major employers and something going awry with them is going to create huge challenges. So can you tell us about your experience? I know it was in healthcare in Hamilton, and just what it means when a community has a major shift in their highest employment sector and how to recover, and what has been your experience in that?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so I'm still in Hamilton today. And what I would say is back around 2014 when or 2008, when I went into healthcare, I was working in a large academic health sciences center. We had about 15,000 employees at the time. And, you know, what we were seeing was massive vacancies that we were having real difficulty filling. So shortages for, you know, nurses and personal support workers, healthcare aides, lab techs, specialized positions, allied health professions. So huge skills shortages. And I noticed when we started to map or evaluate what the sources of our talent were, the vast majority of our employment loss, so somebody left us voluntarily, they were going to another hospital or healthcare organization within our LHIN. When we hired somebody, we noticed that we were just hiring somebody from elsewhere in the LHIN. We weren't really getting people from outside our sort of core geographic area. And so it was interesting because all we were really doing was, forgive the term, but horse trading human capital resources across different organizations. We decided to evaluate like what is actually the knowledge and skills base of our community. So Hamilton's anchor industry, not a surprise, was really steel and manufacturing. We had shifted from steel being the anchor employer in town to over, you know, about a decade, it really shifting to being a knowledge economy. And, you know, we have multiple universities and colleges in town. We have biomedical and health startup industries in town, lots of innovation incubation that was happening in town. But if you looked at our workforce in Hamilton, it really hadn't changed much. So access to some of the programs the minister was talking about didn't exist. So, you know, what do you do with all those displaced steel workers or the people who work in ancillary businesses within the steel industry? It was extremely challenging. For them and for their families. And so we saw major shifts in terms of sort of well-being by industry. And what we started to do with Hamilton Health Sciences, the organization I worked with, was we not only looked at our economic, direct economic value to the community. We were just under $2 billion corporation at the time. But we started to actually measure and map our total economic impact. And it was about $5 billion when looking at all of the ancillary industries. And we had very reliable projections of what kind of knowledge, skills, and jobs growth we were going to see in our community. So we were partnering with groups like our Industry Education Council and other workforce development organizations to really make sure that we had a realistic preview and we could be saying, this is what our predictions are of the nature and types of jobs we're going to need in this community. So let's get some public-private partnerships underway. Let's get some incentives happening to really encourage people to either reskill, go back to school, or even early in their career, partner with high schools to introduce specialist high skills majors programs so that we could start streaming people into healthcare positions.
I think it's useful, this example, to talk about past disruptions, right? Because we've been through this before. COVID's different, everything is different, but there's enough analogous comparators. And so for the EDOs and for the workforce development boards, we can look at past disruptions, 2008 and before that, 2000 and after that, right? And we can learn from what has happened in the past and how we can shift the workforce now going forward. Similar, Daniel, I want to ask a question because your recently published economic report, which you referenced, and if audience members you haven't read it, please go read it. It's an amazing interactive document. 58% of businesses surveyed shrunk between April and September 2020. Those are 2020 numbers, but 17% grew. So, and this varied across the province, right? And so this is what's so interesting about the report and why I encourage people to go actually read it, because you can get into by the region. And they're thinking about their recovery plans differently, and you're hearing from businesses different things. So my question is sort of two parts. Can you give us a little bit more of a sense of disparity between the province? You talked a bit about it in your opening remarks, but any sense of where businesses are now, pessimism or optimism, and in terms of their workforce specifically, like the challenges of having to lay off and then rehire and then lay off again, and then as Louise mentioned and as the minister mentioned, skills now needed are different. So where are businesses on that based on what you're seeing in your report?
Absolutely, Katie. Thank you for that. And apologies for my crazy lighting situation. I've done whatever I could, but it's somehow only gotten worse. Look, I just want to very quickly pick up on a point that was made just a second ago by yourself and Louise, which is, yeah, we have had past disruptions. There was the economic crisis, financial crisis rather, of 2007, 2008. What we're seeing here is a very different crisis, because unlike the 2007 crisis, we've seen certain sectors disproportionately being impacted, and people and demographics that have an outsized share of employment in those sectors as a result find themselves with much higher unemployment levels as a result of the crisis. So when you look at the services sector, retail, recreation, these are sectors that have been very disproportionately impacted, and so as a result, we're looking at a slightly different crisis than we did in 2007, 2008. Now, with respect to your questions, we found the first wave of COVID-19 case counts rising hit businesses really hard. And I do encourage folks to check this out. I know this is a shameless plug, but if you're an EDO with a specific region in mind, Katie, you mentioned it, but the report is interactive, and there's a bunch of appendices in which you can drill down by region and by sector and by business size. So this could give you good insights, more granular than I'll be able to provide right now. What we found is obviously business confidence has been hit pretty hard, particularly in the first wave, and hiring impacts have also been disproportionately, for certain sectors such as retail, accommodation, food services, all those face-to-face businesses. But where the data also shed some light is on specific regions that have been that have higher concentrations of industries that are unduly impacted. So for instance, the Hamilton Niagara region has exhibited one of the lowest confidence levels across Ontario, as well as one of the largest employment impacts in terms of employment losses. We see the same with Northern Ontario, and we see the same with Windsor Essex as well. And as I mentioned briefly in my opening remarks, some of this has to do with the fact that cross-border trade and tourism has had a downstream impact on these areas. Now, generally speaking, we see small businesses suffering the most here, finding themselves with the deepest HR impacts in terms of job losses and cuts, and also in most need of capital. And so certainly a program like the government recently announced, the Small Business Support Grant Program, is huge for things like that. Looking ahead in terms of where is the pulse of business at now, there's a few high-level comments to mention. First would be the fact that what do the economic projections and what do the banks tell us? So they say that there's going to be some rebound, particularly in the latter half of 2021, both in GDP and employment numbers. Now, it's not going to be enough to get us to pre-pandemic levels, but this is basically rooted in an assumption that with the vaccination rollout and the easing of public health restrictions, a lot of these sectors that have been hit the hardest are going to see big bounce backs, particularly in the latter half of 2021. So we hope that some of these regions that I've just mentioned that have seen some of the worst losses are able to bounce back, but that there are some assumptions baked into how that will actually play out, of course. But the second thing to mention on this front is the fact that businesses indicated that, despite this depressing backdrop, 60% of them are confident in their local community's ability for them to thrive. And so this shows us that despite these economic headwinds and despite these challenges, most businesses are still confident that they're in the right communities and have the right ingredients to succeed if we're able to provide certain foundational elements, what we kind of refer to as the industrial commons. So those ecosystems that are going to be able to foster growth. Broadband is a big one. Basic infrastructure, particularly roads when we get to Northern Ontario, especially trade enabling infrastructure. These are all going to be critical aspects to Ontario's recovery and rebuilding plan, and ones that will help bolster confidence of businesses across Ontario.
Thank you very much for that overview. I put folks were requesting a link to that report. So I put a link to the PDF in the chat box, and I'm sure if you have the link to the interactive one, if you could share it, Daniel, that would be great, because it's a very helpful report and helps to think about. We need to understand, as the job sectors change, obviously the workforce, labor force is going to change. We have a question in here from Rebecca Mustard on living wage, which is related to another thing that both of you have been working on. Louise, in your opening remarks, you talked about the disproportionate impact on the pandemic on systemically disadvantaged populations like Black, Indigenous, people of color, persons with disabilities, and women. And so, the question to you will be about equity and diversity and inclusion from a broad community point of view. And this relates to the living wage argument, right? I know, Daniel, I've had conversations with Rocco on the Ontario Chamber of Commerce businesses, and there's examples of businesses within the OCC that pay a living wage, and they promote ideas of living wage, and they advocate for idea of living wage. And all of this comes together, this equity, inclusion, diversity related, I think, to pay equity. That's what I do in my daily job. So Louise, I'll ask you first, because looking at equity and inclusion, and then also thinking about living wage in the background, do you think, this is obviously going to be a driver of economic growth, pay equity, living wage, all these things? Do you think that society and companies, HR professionals, all of it, are we moving fast enough or far enough? What do we need to do to actually reach that point?
So the short answer to the question is, are we going far enough, fast enough? No, we're not. And if you've looked at some of the reporting, the Globe recently did a fabulous study on power and pay gaps, and really looking at, the study was focused just on the public sector. But they sort of broke down, in universities and municipalities and other public sector institutions, what is the composition of the workforce between male and female? What are the pay differences, if any? Who's holding the top leadership seats? So really, from a gender parity perspective and an equity perspective, there's, pretty disheartening data about still the current reality of challenges around gender inequality. And there was a recent similar report, even in professional settings, really looking at, if you look at the law community, and particularly people of color in the law profession, they're continuously disadvantaged. And so, expanding that further to look at, persons with disabilities. 1 in 5 people have a disability, whether visible or invisible, and yet they're radically underemployed. And face incredible barriers to earn the opportunity to be employed, even though their education rates are generally higher than almost the general population. So, I really don't believe we've gone far enough, fast enough. And in some respects, there has to be an intersection of social pressure and a matter of public policy in order to move the needle farther and faster. And topics like a living wage are going to be an essential part of that deliberate discussion and policy setting agenda about what has to be true for Ontario to thrive.
Thank you for that. And I think it's also, you're in a unique place because you're talking to HR professionals across the province, probably giving training on compensation packages and compensation planning and competitive compensation. And so, as you said, it's about partnership, but you're in a unique, pardon me, place to facilitate that conversation because you're leading HR professionals who are leading compensation packages. So thank you. I know you guys are advocates for equity and inclusion and diversity in your organization. Thank you for that continued leadership in that conversation on equity, inclusion, and a living wage.
Thank you.
You know, similar, Daniel, the OCC in late 2020 published the She-Covery Project, Confronting the Gendered Economic Impacts of COVID-19. And, you know, as Commissioner and CAO of the Pay Equity Office of Ontario, I would be remiss not to mention it. First of all, applaud you for that exceptional report. And you really outline the disproportionate effect on women and even the intersectionality within that and how that's transforming the workforce and work and labor relations across the province. So what were the concerns then? So this was like, September's not that long ago, but in like a COVID timeframe, things are happening so fast. So what were the concerns then about emerging gender-based inequalities in the workplace? And do you have a sense now of how SMEs and your members are addressing them or responding them or talking about them?
Katie, thank you for that and for the kind words. I will appropriately just give the credit to my more capable colleague, Senior Policy Analyst Claudia DeSanti, who held the pen on this report and led the charge internally for us on this, and put together a fantastic report with a series of recommendations. And basically, they're broken down kind of into 5 broad areas. And I'll just very quickly touch on them. The first one is around leadership and accountability, and the need to begin with a commitment from stakeholders to set collective targets, reward diversity, ensure that women are included in decision-making bodies. The second is around childcare. So in addition to women being employed in sectors that have been disproportionately impacted by the crisis, the other major change has been childcare, and we know that that's had an adverse impact on a lot of women and forced them into a difficult situation. So this obviously requires a short-term strategy to weather the pandemic, and as well as a longer-term, more system-wide, holistic reform to improve accessibility and affordability for all families. The third and perhaps most pertinent to this panel is around workforce development. And here we say, that the initiatives need to be focused around defining critical skills, accelerating women's reskilling programs. So making sure that the programs that Minister McNaughton is rolling out on reskilling initiatives, some of them are specifically targeted to women's needs in that regard, as well as ensuring that they have a more bolstered representation in skilled trades, an area that we know we need more labor in. And there's a lot of systemic barriers to having women enter the skilled trades. The last 2 points, just very quickly, is around entrepreneurship and flexible work arrangements. So if you look at what's going to be required for Ontario to bounce back from an economic recovery standpoint, small businesses and the entrepreneurial community is going to be key to that. And that ensuring that ecosystem has no barriers that are specific to women being able to start their own business and access capital is going to be essential. And the last point on flexible work arrangements is perhaps a silver lining that has emerged from this pandemic, because we know a bunch of workforces have gone remote, and we know that a portion of them at least are going to maintain that remote capability, and an even larger portion of them are going to maintain some kind of flexible work arrangements. And that could be potentially one way to help even the playing field when it comes to improving outcomes for women within organizations. So in terms of, this is an issue that we're taking seriously, and it's, to be fair to your question, the longer term impacts rather of COVID-19 on women on the workforce remains unknown. And so I won't try to prefigure a response there. What I will say is that for our part, we're trying to look at this in terms of all the work that we do going forward. So it's not just one report that's going to live on our website, but rather, how do we apply this thinking to other projects or reports that we might be working on, other initiatives, other events. I think that's going to be key going forward in terms of what we can do. The other thing to mention is that there's been really strong leaders on this within the business communities. A number of companies have rolled out a variety of initiatives to support women in their workforces specifically. Ontario Power Generation has a childcare center, for instance, at their office. Others are doing more active bias training to, put this issue on people's radars and have them think about it and get informed and educated about it, which is part of the process here. So, I'm encouraged to see the business community take this issue seriously, and specifically a number of companies rolling out initiatives and programs that validate their actual intent around this.
Thank you for that. And I see Louise shaking her head, nodding her head in agreement, because I know HRPA also, you just had your annual conference, and this was a huge topic of discussion because it's affecting the workforce. Related, this is one last question. We might go like a minute or two over, but I want to hit it. It's from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for the question. It's about immigration and the Canadian workforce and the labor market changes. So, we know that immigration is driving Canada's population and workforce, and in order to do that, you have to be a welcoming community or city. And the question is especially for what are some ideas and actions being taken at the provincial level? Louise, you may see this from the HRPA point of view, employers who are dealing with this. Daniel, you might see this from conversations on policies related to immigration and temporary workers, or just immigration in general. But what is there that employers, especially those in rural communities, can do to support this in their communities? Because that's a reality, is that immigration is driving a lot of workforce in certain sectors. So we'll start, Louise, with you, then we'll pop over to Daniel, and this will be the last question.
Great question. And really, I think, if you look at, some of the federal programs that have been introduced to accelerate immigration in specific sectors with specific skills, where we have shortages in many communities, pilot projects and new initiatives are underway there to try to attract people into, for example, northern communities and beyond. So I think that experimentation mindset is really key. But look, it comes down to, will people have a place to live? Is that place to live affordable? Will they have access to childcare? Is the community welcome? Can they get access to primary care? Will their kids be able to get into education? And if English is a second language, will they have the training and opportunities to accelerate those skills? And many employers are really taking that to heart and introducing their own programs to do language training, social emotional well-being programs, skills programs, and even community building. So how do we really create inclusive workplaces? Well, we really have to ensure that there is the proper training in workplaces around welcoming all people, whether they're new immigrants or they are people from communities or even populations that are different to us. And so being more welcoming to the Black community, and eliminating the barriers to systemic discrimination, which there is irrefutable proof exists in our workplaces today, making sure that Indigenous people have access to employment and healthcare and clean water. There's so many things that we really need to be thinking about from a social perspective, but employers are really stepping up because they see this as an opportunity to fill a labor gap that they really haven't had alternatives to fill historically.
That's great. Thank you very much for the HRPA and the perspective of what you're seeing. Daniel, over to you from the Ontario Chamber side.
Look, I will agree with everything Louise just laid out there. The point that I would make is it's an interesting intersection where the socially and morally right thing to do is also the economically right thing to do. And hopefully that makes it easier to drive consensus around some of the topics that we've just been discussing and that Louise was just mentioning in terms of diversity and inclusion, as well as, making sure immigrants can land successfully in various regions in Ontario, particularly those that we know are experiencing the population declines that they have been over the last several decades. One thing that COVID-19 might have done is slow down some of the processes to increase our immigration numbers. And so, looking ahead, the Ontario Chamber is certainly in favor of seeing Ontario's share of that immigration threshold that the federal government sets to be increased, and for that threshold to be increased accordingly as well. We know there are a bunch of specific sectors that require more labor, and one of the only ways we're going to be able to get there is by ensuring we have the full participation of women in the labor market, of Indigenous people, and of new Canadians as well.
Thank you very much for those insights. I hope it was helpful to the audience members who are looking at and considering how they can use that as an opportunity for growth within their communities. We are a few minutes over, so I respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing, Louise, especially from the point of view of the HR professionals who are dealing with, at the actual granular level, this disruption and shift in the workforce and labor force. So folks, if you're not familiar with HRPA, check them out. They're a wealth of knowledge on HR related stuff, but I think very relevant to workforce development and workforce planning, especially for the workforce development boards. Daniel, again, thank you so much for stepping in and sharing the Ontario Chamber of Commerce perspective, which represents businesses across Ontario, and for sharing with us those reports you're doing. So economic development professionals on this call can really understand the shifts happening in business that are going to ultimately impact long-term planning of their workforce and of their labor relations and all of it across the province. So again, go check out OCC's website, a ton of data and reports that you can leverage for your own planning. So thank you very much, panelists, for being here, and I'll turn it back to Kate to wrap up today's conference sessions. Take care.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks to Minister McNaughton, Louise, and Daniel for that very important conversation. In appreciation to our speaker, a contribution to the EDCO Scholarship Fund has been made on their behalf. Another reminder to visit the EDCO conference website, which has additional resources from our innovative partners. You can connect with them and see what they are doing through our Innovator Showcase directory. We also have some additional education provided by our partners on the Innovation on Demand page. You can see how they are evolving and creating resources for economic developers. Thank you again to MDB Insight for sponsoring the Positioning Ontario's Workforce for Recovery and Evolving Times session. We are looking forward to our upcoming sessions on Wednesday, February 17th. The day is sponsored by the Independent Electricity System Operator, and our sessions will be Throwing Out the Rulebook, Policy Development for the New Normal, and Strengthening Municipalities Through Energy Choices. I would like to once again give a shout out to our wonderful planning committee, conference planners, and EDCO staff who have put together such an amazing conference series. Today's sessions have now come to an end. Thank you for joining us for this week's EDCO Evolve On conference. Please look for your login details for next week's webinar on Tuesday, February 16th. Please check your spam or junk folders, and if you don't receive your login information, please email Taylor Chamberlain at the EDCO office. Please continue to connect with one another in the chat for the next 15 minutes. Thank you again for joining us for this week's EDCO Evolve On conference. See you on February 17th. Have a great week, everybody.